What do you call it when the state takes partial ownership of a private company? Just asking questions. 10% of Intel now belongs to the US government. Today's guest says it's time to start using the F word. Economist Bob Murphy is no anti-Trump hashtag resistance fighter quick to shriek fascism. In fact, he says he was relieved when Trump won the last election. But the Austrian economist and host of the Human Action podcast and the Bob Murphy Show tells us he's alarmed by the Intel news and hints from Trump's chief economist that more companies are next. Now, this didn't start with Donald Trump. Remember the bank bailouts? Ever heard of Fannie Mae or GM takeover? This moment has been a long time coming. And Murphy says one surprising culprit is another institution the president is now trying to exert control over, the Federal Reserve. Stay with us as we discuss America's troubling lurch towards China-style state capitalism as Democrats and Republicans each work to consolidate their power over private industry, and why Bob thinks the Federal Reserve is at the root of many of our political and economic problems, and that it's finally time to end it once and for all. Bob Murphy, thank you for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So the federal government now owns 10% of Intel. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick explains that actually this isn't socialism, it's capitalism. John, can you roll that clip?
In 1 week, Intel came in, right? The Biden administration had given $11 billion to Intel, given it to them, done. Corporate just gift. And you turn that into really, it was like less than 5 minutes of conversation. And Intel agreed to give us 10% of their company, which of course was worth $11 billion. So it's not socialism. This is capitalism. If you give someone $11 billion, who's just building in America, they're not doing something special, they're building in America. And their CEO told the president he didn't need the grant. And you said, well, then why don't we get something for it? So it's amazing.
Bob, is this capitalism?
It's not capitalism. I agree it's not socialism. If you had to pick something, it would be the F word if you wanted to merger of corporations and the government. Just a little of the backstory here, though. And what's funny is that commentary there. I actually hadn't seen that particular clip. To me, that's more ominous than the other things I've seen. Like if you wanted to say like why this is a bad idea for numerous reasons, that clip right there, I think just underscores why. So just to give a little bit of the context, Intel was in trouble. They got rid of their CEO last year, and then in March of this year, they appointed this new guy. It's Lip Bhutan is how I'm saying the guy's name. And then he's Malaysian born, and there were some allegations that arose, like things in his past where his prior business relationships and his own personal investing could be involved with China and perhaps their military. I haven't done enough research to know whether those claims have validity or not, but yeah, prima facie, I could understand why that would alarm people. Senator Tom Cotton was, demanding stuff. And then Trump, I think it was on August 7th, put out on Truth Social saying, there we go right there. The CEO of Intel is highly conflicted and must resign immediately. There's no other solution to this problem. Thank you for your attention to this problem. And then, doing PR damage control, they all go there. And then when the dust settles, it's, the federal government now owns 10% of our business. And this is supposed to be like, this was all buddy stuff. And this was all voluntary. And also just more of the context, Trump was bragging about how, hey, we got this 10% or 9.9, whatever it is, percent share of their stock without paying a dime, right? We got it for zero. And what they mean is, and the clip you guys just played there emphasizes this, is that the Biden administration had given them two different types of grants under the CHIPS Act. And but they hadn't actually gotten the money yet. And so what happened here is there was the Trump administration said, oh, hey, those billions that the Biden administration promised you guys last year when they were still in power? Well, if you're going to take that money, and I know you give us 10%. So
to be clear, they got some of the money already, and they're still waiting for more of it to flow in.
Right. And so, you can say what you will about that previous thing, but Lutnick saying this is capitalism. No, capitalism's not if the head of a company last year gives your company some money And then they get a new leader, and he comes in, he says, yeah, you know that money that the previous guy said he would give to you? Give us 10% in exchange. And by the way, I've been threatening that you should resign, and I'm the president of the United States. I mean, whatever you want to call this, that's not capitalism. And if anything, that would, to me, scare the crap out of regular business leaders to say, this Trump regime is out of control. They can just start putting stuff on social media, and then they get 10% of your company 2 weeks later. I wouldn't want to be located under their jurisdiction. If anything, I would want to say, this is why I would want to stay or steer clear of the U.S. So this is the exact opposite of what the proponents think this is supposed to achieve.
Is there precedent for this type of thing in the U.S.?
Yeah. I mean, people were talking about like with GM and AIG and so forth, like back in the was it George W. Bush, then going into Obama. That there were some things like this where the government has taken ownership temporarily in certain institutions, and I would say and a lot of free market libertarian types were adamantly against that stuff back then too. And ironically, some people who are now, in the very MAGA camp. So yes, this is not literally the first time in history the U.S. government has taken partial ownership in a private company, but I would say it's not capitalism anytime it's been done.
I mean, isn't the lesson more less the wouldn't the lesson, if you're a large corporation, not be you're not I'm afraid to go to the United States of America, but if I am big and deemed important enough, then I'm going to get a bailout when my business is failing, and B, this exciting new partnership with the federal government.
Well, right. So there's different ways of analyzing this, and so yes, one, in terms of like what's the similarity in those things. Yeah, big corporations, they're too big to fail. They can be relied on that the government will come in and bail them out. So that is bad from a, I would think a taxpayer, just general market efficiency standpoint. But in terms even of where to be located or whatnot, it's so on the one hand, Intel benefited from, the cronyism of the Biden administration. But I'm saying just if you take a snapshot and say on the margin, what did the Trump administration just achieve? As Lutnick just said, it was, last month, Intel thought it had one situation, and now without any new influx of money, they have to give 10% of their shares, over to the Trump administration. So that clearly Intel is not happy with what the Trump administration is doing. So if you want to say that, the Biden administration was good in keeping important defense-related firms here in the U.S., but then Trump came and, saber rattled and made them get concerned. But that's the exact opposite. They're saying, no, Biden administration, just handing out money with no strings attached. This is crazy. So again, I think the MAGA camp, they have to make up their mind which one is it here. That this Intel was not happy about what just happened over the last 3 weeks.
I mean, given the situation that we are in, where both parties to some degree have been doing this for a while, what I hear Ludnick saying there, putting aside the question, which I completely agree with you, that this is not free market capitalism. He says he's basically saying the government now, at least we're getting something back for the money we're giving to these companies, as opposed to just no strings attached corporate handout that the Democrats like to give out. Is there a certain logic to that?
I mean, possibly, right? In other words, like with all these things, it's kind of like if you insist on 15 things happening and then say to me, okay, so now the 6th thing, do you agree that that's a good idea? But then it looks like I'm ending up, agreeing with the whole proposal. But let me just pivot to something else that Lutnick also said. I don't know if it was at that same conference, but that he was saying, hey, we're looking at other companies like Lockheed Martin, 97% of their revenue comes from federal contracts. So what, why don't we get the American people? And so I just want to explain that that's bad economics, right? Like if you buy a lot, like you go to Starbucks a lot, it doesn't follow that therefore in your personal portfolio, you should want to invest more in Starbucks, right? In other words, those are two separate things. Now, what you could say is, hey, we're talking to Lockheed Martin and pointing out that 97% of their revenue comes from us. So that's why in the interest of the taxpayer, we want to really hammer down and, look at these contracts and make sure we're getting the best price possible and blah, blah, blah. Because after all, we're going to walk if you don't, and you got to do that would be the way to do it. But it's not that, oh, yes, we're going to overpay and give them all this largesse, but then we're going to have a 10% stake. And so we're going to get some of that back for our people. Like that doesn't make any sense. Right. So clearly the best thing to do for the taxpayers is don't be overpaying in the first place.
National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett has basically said that actually, it's very good that we're trying to take a stake in Intel and possibly other companies too, because the idea here is that we're going to be creating a sovereign wealth fund. In a sense, sovereign wealth funds aren't totally unprecedented in the US, right? Like Alaska has one, for example, and
Right.
that pays out dividends to its people every year. But creating a sovereign wealth fund for the United States, like at this scale, certainly has not been done before in our country, nor is there any sort of plan that's been released to the American public about the governance of this fund and what exactly, how exactly it will function and what types of, deals must be made with companies in order to populate the sovereign wealth fund. What do you make of this? Does this feel like just attempting to give a veneer of credibility to these actions, or do you think there's something actually interesting here?
Okay, so great question and good research that, yeah, a lot of people don't know about the I think it's called the Permanent Fund. I did a
Yep.
paper years ago for the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian-based free market think tank, because there were proposals there for Alberta, like that it, has a lot of oil revenue coming in. That they were going to try to set up something like that. And so, yeah, with Alaska too, with their crude oil revenues, that they have this thing that anybody who's a citizen of Alaska, they just get checks
Well,
periodically.
Bob, this isn't
Yeah.
good research. This is just the fact that I have these like stupid pipe dreams about moving to Alaska. And so I annoy my
Oh,
husband
is
about this. And this is part of my sales pitch to my husband.
Oh, okay, great, okay. So, so anyway, yes, so the context here is, yeah, there are especially country I think Norway has a big one too, and that was, in the paper I did, I was the function of the paper was to say lessons for Canada in terms of good, better and more foolish ways of doing this to stop the growth of the government. Because what the people wanted, like the designers of the system, is like, oh yes, there's a sense in which the people own this natural heritage. We don't want politicians who come in here just for a short term to be like selling off the stuff to their buddies, and that sort of taking the money away, or the resources away from the people, right? That was the idea. And so a lot of these proposals were saying just go ahead and distribute the funds directly to the public, as opposed to funding spending programs. Because once you allow for the politicians to start spending the money as opposed to just giving it to the people in flat, lump sum distributions, then politics gets involved and they can pick winners and losers, that sort of thing, right? So that was the idea. But again, the idea is there is this natural resource that is being sold because it's on public land. And then what do you do with the revenue? And so here that's different from just saying, oh, hey, the US government has a lot of cash flow going through it because of all this tax revenue every year. What if we diverted a portion of that into just a portfolio of investments? I mean, among other things, there's 37 trillion in debt right now, plus all the unfunded liabilities. So that's an odd thing to be doing. And then in general, it's what just the essence of that. They're like taking money from taxpayers and investing it on their behalf. And in general, like, no, I don't want Washington running a hedge fund. That they don't have the right incentives, among other reasons. That they would tend to be taking bigger risks, or the more obvious threat is there could be a lot of corruption involved in terms of who they give the money to. So you would just be giving the people in DC yet another carrot and or stick to use against everybody else, right? So I think for all those reasons, that's a bad idea. Look, private taxpayers, if you want to invest in the portfolio that Lutnick wants to put tax dollars in, you can do that yourself, right? That's the beauty of voluntary capitalism, is people can invest in whatever they want. You don't need politicians taking all of our money collectively and then doling it out into a portfolio. That's crazy. There's no economic justification for that.
So there's no alternative set of circumstances where where you think a sovereign wealth fund would make sense. I mean, yeah, taking over, 10% of a company has lots of other problems, but the reason I am following up on it is because it's something that the Trump administration keeps bringing up over and over again. They've talked about using the Bitcoin holdings that they have that they've seized
It's
from
just-
drug dealers and the Silk Road and so forth to bootstrap that. You mentioned the idea of natural resources. Like, is there a less objectionable way that let's just imagine a world where the government was not perpetually trillions of dollars in debt and was running a surplus. Would there be a less objectionable way to have a sovereign wealth fund?
Okay, so The narrow answer to your question there is I would say no, even in that world, if we're talking about broad-based tax revenue, and if the government, it's like, the Andrew Jackson comes back from the dead, they pay off the debt,
Yeah.
and now we're running surpluses, I would say, okay, then lower the tax rate or get rid of you know what I mean? Like, that would be the
Yeah.
way to deal with, oh, man, we got these pesky surpluses, what do we do? That's what I would do, all right? I want to be, I don't want your listeners to think, like, I'm not being purely some knee-jerk ideological libertarian, like, I hate everything. I have said, like, the idea of a Bitcoin strategic reserve, I didn't just dismiss that out of hand. I was saying, given that right now central banks around the world have gold stockpiles, and yes, I don't want there to be central banks, but given that they exist, it makes sense that they not only have baskets of, uh, government debt from the major other currencies involved, but also they have stockpiles of gold. I said, by the same token, if you think Bitcoin over the next few decades is going to continue to rise in importance and be like a reserve, like, or hedge against inflation, like the way gold is, it would make sense for them to start stockpiling Bitcoin as well. So I'm not against that in principle. So I'm trying to be the reasonable guy here, but I am saying that let me put it this way. What I could possibly see making sense is if they came out and said, we have all these offshore oil resources and things that those Democrat with their environmentalist crazies in their base haven't let U.S. companies develop, and this is crazy. That's why we got to, we used to import oil from the Middle East. Now, actually, we're net exporters. But if they said we're going to develop that, and instead of just privatizing everything, which we would all prefer, but we can't do that for political reasons, we will go ahead and lease that to developers, and then the revenue there is going to be a separate program, and we'll invest that in a broad basket of things, and we'll have disinterested trustees on the board to avoid. I could see that. But again, what I'm trying to get at, the distinction, the sovereign wealth funds are either explicitly tied to, like, natural resources for countries that are blessed with a lot of oil or whatever, or also like certain monarchies. Like, that's where the term, I think, comes from. Like, it's the sovereign. So it's like, oh, our family just has all this property and stuff, and we got to do something with the money. And so there, it's not really like tax revenue.
Have we
It's because
considered
they're
the
a monarchy.
possibility that Trump simply likes the term because it implies that he is the sovereign?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is we have to first make Trump permanent king, and then I'm on board with everything. But I want to do it the
Exactly.
right way, above board.
I think you're making the case for him right here.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, Kevin Hassett, who Liz mentioned, brought that up in this clip. We can kind of think of him as Trump's chief economic advisor. And interestingly, he previously worked at the Free Market American Enterprise Institute, and then found himself on CNBC defending all of this and even suggesting more corporate uh, uh, taking of equity in corporations on the horizon. Let's roll that clip of Hassett explaining that.
The president has made it clear all the way back to the campaign that he thinks that in the end it would be great if the U.S. could start to build up a sovereign wealth fund. And so I'm sure that at some point there'll be more transactions, if not in this industry, in other industries.
Okay, so we should expect the U.S. government to be taking more equity stakes in businesses around the country. That is something that if you're a CEO this morning watching us, you should say, okay, the sovereign wealth fund may be coming and trying to effectively buy in some kind of equity stake.
It's possible, yeah, that's absolutely right. That if in the past the federal government has been giving money away lickety-split to companies, and the taxpayers have received nothing in return. And so now what's happening with the Intel deal is the CHIPS Act money is going out as planned, but instead of it just going out and disappearing into the ether, the U.S. taxpayers are getting a little bit of equity. I can really not see how anyone would think that's a bad thing, unless you thought that the government was then going to go in and run the company. But these are going to be shares that don't have voting rights. The government's going to stay out of it.
So that is really my biggest fear. What the assurance that he's saying that is what he's saying is not going to happen. That's exactly what I'm afraid is going to happen. That we're going towards this China-style system where the government just has a seat on the board of directors, and is, perhaps has even with just one seat, being the government, might have more sway than your typical board member. How credible do you think what Hassett is saying is there, Bob, when he's reassuring us not to worry?
Okay, let me probably say as a disclaimer to this stuff, or a caveat. Given that you're going to have a bunch of people advising the U.S. president who are going to be doing deals like this, I like the judgment of Lutnick and Hassett and things, more than I would have liked the team that would have been around Kamala Harris. Okay,
Yeah,
so
fair.
in that sense, and I was very relieved when Trump got reelected. All right, now some people might say, "Oh, that you're going to rue those words, Murphy," but I'm saying, if we're just forget the politics or whatever, just looking at, the actual actions, certainly in the economic sphere. I want to say that, like, but
You're safe here, Bob. I
I
voted
know.
for Trump too.
I
Don't
think
worry.
thanks,
You're
guys.
good.
And
We're
so
not
you're
gonna
just
hurt you.
asking questions. I get it. I'm just giving answers.
Yeah, well, and we've got, I mean, just to refresh everyone's memory,
Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris's first announced, one of the only concrete policies she ever announced was, oh, grocery prices are too high, so we need to
Right.
bully the grocery
Yeah.
companies into setting price controls. So that was not a reassuring path
And
either, to
She
your
might
apropos,
have
point.
appointed Zoran one of her grocery czars. So,
yeah, I was gonna
like,
say, apropos to that, I recently on social media, I like to dabble and try to do memes once in a while just to keep it real. And I did the Drake one where it's the MAGA right now, and he's like, waving his hand against the New York City government owning a grocery store, but then owning it, the federal government
Yeah,
owning a
well,
chip
we should thread
manufacturer.
that up
That's
in this
cool, right?
stream for
So
sure.
I love
anyway, and then a bunch of MAGA people explained to me why. No, it's totally different. What are you talking about, you idiot? All right.
Mhm.
So yeah, so there, you're right. There's a bunch there. Even like to own 10% of the company, even if technically you don't get to vote on things, still to threaten, hey, if we don't like what you're doing, we're going to dump all of our shares next Thursday. Like, that's a big deal if all of a sudden 10% of the company gets dumped, right? You know what I mean? So even though they aren't voting, but also too, it's sort of like trying to have their cake and eat it too, where, oh, this is such an important integral thing to our national defense and all this stuff. And so we want to have this government business partnership, but we're not going to influence what they do whatsoever. And so it's like, well, if you're not influencing any of their business decisions, then whatever they were going to do, they were going to do. And so that's not affecting U.S. competitiveness or the fact that our fighter jets are going to get Intel chips instead of something that the Chinese are putting Trojan horses, right? So there is this weird dance where all the points being raised by Trump supporters on this stuff, a lot of them contradict each other. And in particular for the Intel one, if you wanted to say, no, it's just the injection of equity and capital, that's what's, giving them a leg up. We'll see, but they already had that. Biden already gave it to them. You get what I'm saying? So,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, no, I mean,
clearly,
I think
yeah.
that's a really important point, because there is this pincher effect going on where, the previous administration is the one that passed the CHIPS Act, and it was cheered not just by, far leftists or anything. The kind of centrists, the people who are calling themselves like abundance Democrats now, they were big fans of this. The people, they're kind of now speaking a more market oriented game, but they're like, it's good for this one particular industry, because we need to onshore semiconductors, we need to onshore chip making because it's a national security issue. Um, they I'll like take them at their word that they did not expect this to happen, but you are opening it. It does seem like you're opening up the door once you start infusing industries for money to say, well, hey, what do we as the government get for
It,
this?
and just like a completely different example of this phenomenon, which just shows the insidiousness of, government intervention and how it just keeps creeping all across. I'm sure you guys are familiar. I mean, when I was first getting into libertarian stuff, like as a teenager reading things, and there was a proposal to pass where I was growing up, like you were allowed to ride motorcycles without a helmet, and then there was some measure that was going to insist on that. And some people were saying, "Hey, you should be free to do what you want," but the trump card was, "Well, no, because if you get in an accident, then we, the taxpayers, have to pay for your treatment at the hospital, and so it's in our interest for just to protect our money. That's why we got to insist that you do." And same thing with like seatbelt legislation, whatever. So that's what I'm saying here. That opening up the door and saying, "Hey, if you in any way accept taxpayer money for something, then all the down the road we can come back to you and say, you know what, you're taking our money. That means we can do X, Y, Z." The same thing with how they're getting into like controlling speech codes on campus. Well, it's not. Hey, this isn't interfering with private business. They're taking a bunch of educational grants, so that's why we can come in and do X, Y, right? So when you get everybody to be indirectly or directly receiving government assistance somehow, then you can implement whatever the heck you want. And technically, oh, it's just putting strings on the money we're handing out. So there you go.
I want to briefly ask about how you would feel if you were one of the executives in charge of NVIDIA right now. I mean, it's fair to say that companies like TSMC, which in that clip that Zach showed, the ticker was on the screen, that's not an American company, but there's a massive sort of chips arms race happening right now. And the US government has very clearly put its thumb on the scale in favor of Intel at the expense of companies like NVIDIA. Bob, how would you feel if you were the NVIDIA CEO right now?
Well, I mean, like I said, I think I would be thinking that I would not want to be in the jurisdiction of the United States, that at least we can, sort of stay away from this guy, that, yeah, that it might be like a deal with the devil, right? Again, it's Trump openly called for the guy to resign because of his thing. And then the guy goes hat in hand to Washington. And they come out with this great new deal. So I, I don't think that everyone looking at this is thinking, oh man, the Intel, they went in there and got this sweet deal, and now how can we compete with them? Again, just to give people context, like, it is well known and documented. Like I said, that was why Intel's last CEO got canned, is they're getting crushed like in the AI market. It has to do with like focusing on CPUs versus GPUs and stuff that, I'm going to quickly come up against the knowledge, the boundaries of my ignorance here, but clearly Intel is not, what it was 20 years ago or so. You know what I mean? Like, we used to think, oh, that they're the dominant force here, and they have been getting crushed on certain areas, even like in personal computing and whatnot, from other companies. So, yeah, I think, yeah, this is like the last gasp, and this might give them some more runway. Especially the other thing too, kind of circling back to what you were saying, Zach. Now that the U.S. has a 10% share in this, they can't let it go down because that would be embarrassing. And so I think that you're right, Liz, maybe to your point, that people will now suspect, oh, there's going to be more subsidies and bailouts going forward now that the U.S. government is like a partner with this company.
Yeah,
But in
affirmative
terms,
action for shitty chip makers, right?
right, yeah. So, but again, if I'm somebody running a nimble company and I think, no, we make better chips or for, lower price or whatever, I'm I'm not going to be worried about this so much.
I just feel like there's this bipartisan consensus that has emerged now that because AI is the hot thing and it's, there's obviously trillions going in in private investment in the industry. So I'm not saying it's not a real and transformative technology, but it's kind of being taken for granted that therefore it government policy needs to be oriented around that. And like something that in this past week that has kept coming back to me was that there was this press conference that Trump held on his first full day in office, and he gave a speech with three CEOs that announcing something called Project Stargate. I want to play just a little bit of that clip because I think it explains something about what's going on here. John, could you roll that?
We're joined by Oracle Executive Chairman Larry Ellison, SoftBank CEO, my friend Masa Yoshi-san, and CEO of OpenAI, and I would say by far the leading expert based on everything I read, Sam Altman. So that's great that you're coming in together. That's a massive group of talent and money. Together, these world-leading technology giants are announcing the formation of Stargate. So put that name down in your books, because I think you're going to hear a lot about it in the future. A new American company that will invest $500 billion at least in AI infrastructure in the United States. China is a competitor and others are competitors. We want it to be in this country, and we're making it available. I'm going to help a lot through emergency declarations, because we have an emergency. We have to get this stuff built. So they have to produce a lot of electricity, and we'll make it possible for them to get that production done very easily at their own plants if they want.
So yeah, Trump loves his emergencies, but we talked about this a little bit in a previous episode with Kelsey Piper that we'll link below. And like at the time, it it seems kind of like it could be a good thing, even from a libertarian perspective. Like he's using emergency powers, which I don't like, but he's using it to get like bad energy regulations out of the way so that it's easier to build data centers and reversing some of the clumsier Biden era AI regulation. But now I'm looking at it a little bit differently because of what has transpired. And one of the CEOs, those three CEOs there, is from SoftBank, which invested $2 billion in Intel on the same day that Scott Bessent floated the idea of government equity in the company. And they've reportedly, I'm going to pull this up here. Yeah, they've reportedly been lobbying the administration for a while now for money or for tax breaks. SoftBank officials have spoken with federal and state government officials to discuss possible tax breaks for companies building factories or otherwise investing in this $1 trillion AI industrial park, including talks with U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, the people said. So when I see all this, my takeaway is Trump has an industrial policy, and that industrial policy is the U.S. government is going to put the pedal to the metal to accelerate AI here. Is that something like, is that kind of industrial policy something that inevitably leads to nationalization, or are those, AI development is good. Are those goals that can actually be set and executed in a free market, property rights respecting way?
Okay, so I'll answer this way. I was very happy when Trump, I think right after he won the election, you said that we're going to make the U.S. the AI and crypto capital of the world, right? And in my day job, I work for this company Infinio. We're putting assets on the blockchain. So I mean, we are happy to hear that too. Okay, good. And the contrast is under the Biden administration, there were people can go look up, like Caitlin Long has done a lot of research on this. It's called Operation Choke Point, and there was Operation Choke Point 2.0. Right? There's a lot of stuff where explicit and implicit, where it was just known that, yeah, the federal government does not like people building in the crypto space here. If you want to do something innovative in crypto or blockchain, do it somewhere else. The U.S., you got to stay away. And so for them just to come through and stuff like the Genius Act or whatever now, just say, here are the rules. You want to build something here, here's how you do it. And we're happy to do it. God bless America. We love blockchain, right? So that is great. But you anticipate what my answer was going to be, Zach. That get rid of goofy regulations. I don't like doing things with executive order, but if Biden did it, then you can, hey, he started, and we can, the only thing that can stop a bad president with an executive order is a good president with an executive order, right? Okay, that's fine. But I'm saying what the measures, as long as it's like lowering taxes, things like that. That would be great. Getting rid of silly regulation, or even just saying here's what the rules are, so that people aren't afraid if we build something for 3 years that you're just going to pull the rug out from under us and then say it's illegal, right? So all that stuff is great. Just there was things in the Biden administration, people would go to try to meet with the head of the SEC just to say, how can we do this? And they wouldn't even take a meeting. You know what I mean? So it was really it was just putting things on hold. And lots of people in this space, it was just well known that, you can't do anything in the U.S.
So you don't have anything. Elsewhere. So you don't have a problem with the notion of a president just setting these priorities and saying the crypto industry should be doing better here in the U.S. AI should be doing better here in the U.S. It's just really comes down to the execution. There's nothing wrong with kind of setting that as a priority or agenda item.
Right. I mean, if what you're getting at is like, well, really, shouldn't he just be saying, we will, whatever is profitable and the invisible hand will guide things, and I have no opinion whatsoever. I am here just to dutifully execute. I mean, I guess that would be better still, but that's kind of goofy. If somebody, says, hey, we're the greatest country in the world and we want to raise the standard of living of Americans, I wouldn't object and say, well, maybe actually the optimal thing is for Pakistanis to have I get it. You got to see stuff with the camera. But in terms of, the policies, and if the way they're going to achieve that is to have taxpayer investments in these companies, and that it's going to be clear behind the scenes that, you got to be if Trump is mad at you, your company's in trouble. That's crazy. Again, not just because of the corruption and just in principle, but also for the long-term development. If that's the situation, and it's like, oh no, we work things out and it's fine. Still, you're, down the road, companies are not going to want to be under the jurisdiction of a regime that operates like that. If for no other reason that Trump's not going to be in there for, even if you think, no, Trump is reasonable and all the guys around him, they know what they're doing. They're all smart business people. Okay, well, what happens, when it's a different regime, right? And we have to set that precedent. Just like now, to justify this thing that's going on with Intel, people are going back to the GM bailouts and whatever.
Yep.
Well, the more they do this, that's going to be harder to stop the next time when it's people in charge that you don't like and you don't trust those people. It's going to be harder. Like if a Democrat goes to do it, what are the Republicans going to say? That's socialism. You can't have the federal government investing in companies. Yes, you can. You guys just set up a sovereign wealth fund. What are you talking about?
So, Donald Trump has been at war with the Federal Reserve since retaking office. He's been pretty constantly attacking Fed Chair Jerome
Jeez.
Powell for keeping interest rates too high. And now he's trying to force out Biden appointed Fed board member named Lisa Cook for alleged mortgage fraud. The mortgage fraud case is kind of interesting because basically she declared as her primary residence two different houses that I think she purchased within like 2 weeks of each other.
Yeah.
So, again, not the most egregious thing in the entire world, but also like not a great thing to do. And, one of the real challenges is that he's trying to fire her for cause, but this isn't something that has really been proven. Like we don't have very much evidence as to, the veracity of this claim and whether or not it actually did happen in the way that he's portraying it. But if he were to succeed in his dismissal of Cook, he would then be appointing, another member to the board, as well as a new chair after Powell's term ends in May. So 4 of the 7 members of the board would be Trump appointees. What do you think Trump would be trying to accomplish if he is able to execute this seizure, this takeover of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, so just to underscore what you said there, Liz, I agree with your analysis that the way the rules are right now in terms of like the powers of the various people involved, that yeah, the president can fire somebody that's on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve for cause, but the issue here is that what she's accused of, even if she did do it, it's it's borderline. Like, is that really something you can fire?
It
Okay,
was before her term started. It's something where, it's to my mind, not the most egregious violation of all time. But at the same time, I think you can make the case that, it is an unethical thing to do and people ought to behave in an above the board manner. And
right.
she shouldn't have done that. But we also kind of don't know how true Trump's claim is because we just have no transparency into any of this. Right.
Right. Yeah. So my understanding is like coming from some like FHA guy or something is the one who's saying this is what she did. So my concern is if this works from the Trump administration's point of view, it would be not that hard down the road. Other people could do things like where you just get one of your subordinates in the administration to allege that somebody in the Fed did something, and then you can go ahead and remove the person. Even if it turns out 2 years later that they didn't, like maybe you got your key policy move of the Fed cutting interest rates or whatever, you already pushed that through, right? And by the time that people realize, oh, wait a minute, that guy was just making that up. So that's really the issue, just for people at home who aren't following this, is it's not like she's been convicted of a crime or something. It's just this one person is alleging that this is what she did, and Trump, on the basis of that, is saying we can't have a regulator who's unethical like this on financial matters.
And to add to that, interestingly, Cook is fighting this through her lawyers. And so this is something where you have not heard the last of this, dear viewer, unfortunately. This will be percolating up through the courts. But then also, this creates a really interesting sort of legal challenge where Powell and company basically need to decide what they do in the interim as to whether or not Cook has a job and is like allowed inside of the building. Because again, Powell has a duty to sort of, act in accordance with the law. And so there's this question of, is the executive acting illegally here? And what should Powell do exactly, especially because so much scrutiny is on him. But continue.
Yeah. So, but the broader context here, as you alluded to, is that ever since he got reelected, Trump has been ramping up the campaign against Jerome Powell, saying, they need to cut, this is crazy. And there were allegations too that I think were like the statements were correct that I've seen other people making in terms of like the Fed's decision, like, no, it's not time yet to cut because we're worried about inflation. And then looking like when Biden was still in office, in like the combination of the unemployment rate and inflation were way, they were willing to cut when Biden was now, but not right now. You know what I mean? Like in terms of some of the variables at play, it looked like an inconsistency in what they did. And so you could wonder if, there was some politics involved. So that all may be true, but, this does get to, it's this funny thing where, there's this vaunted, Fed independence, and yet the Fed is, it's a creation of the federal government. It's this weird quasi-private public thing where the Federal Reserve is literally owned by private banks, right? So the analogy I was using, like that'd be like if the FDA were literally owned by pharmaceutical companies and paid dividends to them as it regulated. And a lot of people said, that's crazy. That's how our central bank works right now. So that's a weird setup to begin with. But then, go ahead.
If we are to have it at all, which I know how you feel about this, what would the better setup be?
Okay, so I mean, I've argued one thing to just point out is the U.S. dollar is not the same thing as the Federal Reserve, right? That what did Americans use as their money in 1912? They used the U.S. dollar. The Fed wasn't created until late 1913, like the authorizing list, right? So I want to be clear that you could talk about neutering or even getting rid of the Fed. That doesn't mean Americans now don't have money. Okay, so there's that element. So what I've argued recently is I was on a zero hedge debate saying we should get rid of the Fed. And I said, return that power to the Treasury. Not that I love the government issuing money, but given that the government's going to be in charge of producing U.S. dollars, I said, return that function to the Treasury. You don't need this quasi public private institution that's in the middle of everything and that has all these special prerogatives given to it by the government, but yet we're independent. One little anecdote on this, just to show how crazy this stuff is. In the fall of 2008, that's, when there was the crisis, AIG and everything, and the bailouts began with, the Fed started buying mortgage-backed securities like crazy. They had all these special emergency facilities that they set up that financial institutions that were in trouble could go and pledge collateral and get short-term loans from the Fed. So in December of 2008, Bernanke, who was the head of the Fed, goes before some congressional subcommittee, and they're asking him, he's going through and outlining all the many billions of dollars like in short-term loans that they kept rolling over just in the past few months, unprecedented stuff. And somebody asked him and said, Chairman Bernanke, can you give us a list of the institutions that are recipients of all these billions of dollars? And he said, well, no, I can't do that. I don't know if he said senator or congressman. I forget who he was testifying before. He said, I can't do that because the whole point of this program is to restore public confidence. If the public knew which institution was tapping these facilities, there would be a run and that would defeat the purpose. So to get people to realize, the Fed is, in a sense, out of thin air, creating billions of dollars and handing them out to people and won't even tell Congress who they're giving the money to. That's an incredible amount of power to give this organization of people that aren't directly elected or anything. And for them now to say that, oh, even the president, if you don't like us, you can't touch it. Like, it's a weird thing that people just assume, oh, that's normal.
But bringing up the fact that they're not elected, like, isn't what you're saying is almost bolstering the case in favor of them being appointed and them having really, really, really long terms, which is exactly the system that we have now, right? Like, isn't that better and more politically insulated than if they were in fact directly elected? Or what Trump is trying to do, where, he's able to sort of mess with the terms and attempt to get more appointments to be able to basically seize control and appoint loyalists.
Okay, so yeah, just to make sure people realize, so yeah, to be on the board of governors right now, it's a 14-year appointment.
And it's appointed, so not directly elected, but isn't
yeah,
you were saying that, elected would be perhaps more directly tied to the will of the people. And I'm like, well, wait, isn't some amount of insulation actually useful the way that it currently is structured?
I mean, that's the theory. So there's two things going on here, right? And I'm not saying we're going to solve this here, but I'm saying the competing interests are.
We'll figure it out.
Okay, great.
Don't worry, we got it.
You're right. On the one hand, like, people say, oh, you want Nancy Pelosi in charge of monetary policy. No, I don't. But I also don't want people who are connected to big banks handing out billions of dollars to. And the other thing too is later we learned that some of those loans were going to foreign-owned banks too. So it wasn't even like they were bailing out U.S. banks. Meanwhile, people are losing their homes 2008, 2009, and the Fed is bolstering mortgage-backed securities because we got to, keep credit flowing and stuff. So I am saying that, yes, the theory is by having these long appointments or whatever, it takes politics out of it. Sort of like the same principle of why college professors get tenure. Like, they got to be able to speak their mind. You want the Fed officials doing what they're doing. But I think it's kind of fake in one sense that nobody, like, give a different example. During the Obama years, there were 4 years in a row where they ran $1 trillion plus budget deficits. And that was right around the time that the Fed all of a sudden began these QE programs where they were buying trillions of dollars of treasury securities. Just had nothing to do with each other. The Fed's no, they didn't. And during all the major wars, you can look at the Fed's balance sheet. They decide monetary policy calls for us loading up on treasuries right when the government has to go fight a war. That's kind of funny how that works.
So the political independence you're saying is a myth. Then what causes that feedback loop between the politics and what the Fed does if they have this they're supposed to have this structural insulation? Why are they still affected by politics?
Well, so I think one thing is because even though there are points where there is politics involved, right? Like the president has to nominate people and things. So I think there's a sense on the front end that they know we're not going to put somebody in this position unless they're going to play ball, right? Like it was interesting, like with Bernanke, a lot of his academic work was talking about like, here was what happened during the Great Depression and here, and then when he was running the Fed, he was doing certain policy moves, like they started paying interest on reserves in October of 2008. I used to say at the time, the Fed began paying banks to not make loans to their customers, which is kind of a weird thing to be doing, right? And some academics were confused, like, why are they doing that? It doesn't fit with Bernanke's academic work. And it was like they're funneling billions of dollars to the banker, so anyway, it's like, yeah, sometimes college professors don't. Yeah. Anyway, so I think there's that element that to get into that position, people know you're going to play ball with us, and there's all sorts thing once you leave office too. There's the plush and consulting contracts and things, ways they take care of you afterwards, like the revolving door. So I think there's that element. But I guess just to address the fundamental problem that Liz was putting her finger on before. I mean, yeah, to really make it independent, you could just say there's this group of people. We have no oversight whatsoever. We're going to give you the printing press and just please use it responsibly. But going forward, we can't control you in any way. That wouldn't be a good idea, right? So I'm saying there has to be some kind of oversight. And so, to me, the ultimate solution is right. That's why I don't like there being a central bank. Nobody should have the power of the printing press the way the Fed does right now. Let it all be voluntary. And then, that kind of solves the problem. But given that you are going to give this extraordinary power to this group to then say, we don't even have to know who you're giving billions of dollars to me, that seems crazy.
I want to push back a little bit. I mean, you are much more well read on the sort of recent history, Great Recession, malfeasance that may or may not have taken place. I just simply don't know enough about that time to really comment smartly on it. But are you, in fact, perhaps not giving the Fed nearly enough credit, especially looking at very recent history and the fact that to some degree the sort of soft landing, as it was termed, was to some degree pulled off, and that the dual mandate, which is maximum employment and, attempting to keep inflation decently low, it's been a very tricky balance and sort of tricky economic waters that the Fed has attempted to wade through for the last few years. And now we are seeing signs that perhaps the labor market is not looking as good as we had previously thought. And the Fed is being very cautious with trying to figure out, how it does rate setting, given the fact that we're sort of seeing these labor market corrections coming out. We need kind of better data from the BLS in order to actually know how the situation is emerging over time. But like, are we perhaps not giving the existing, Fed enough credit for how decently well they've navigated the extreme trickiness of the last 5 years?
Well, okay, let me answer this way. So big picture, the Fed was created, late 1913 and was fully up and running in 1914. The stock market crash of 1929, right? And then the Great Depression. So the Fed had been up and running for 15 years when the Great Depression occurred. So that's clearly on the Fed's watch. Ironically, in the early 2000s, Milton Friedman had a birthday party, and he had done a lot of academic work blaming the Fed for what caused, the original problem of the Great Depression. And Ben Bernanke, he wasn't chair at the time, but he was like on the Fed Board of Governors, I think, was at this party and said to, he gets the mic and he says, Milton Friedman, if I may slightly abuse my position here as a member of the Fed, you're right. We did it, meaning the Fed caused the Great Depression. He said, but thanks to your work, we won't do it again. So he's saying it's the early 2000s saying we're not going to have another big crisis like that because that was like a mulligan. Okay. Going forward, we're good. And then they had, so I'm saying there's all these crises that happen on the Fed's watch. And then we're supposed to thank the Fed for it could have been worse. It's like the Fed's, hey, at least you didn't screw up the economy as bad as you did the last time this happened, right? So there's that element. And again, the idea, like what happened why did grocery prices go up so much? Well, if you just go look at any measure of the money supply, in 2020, the Fed opened up the spigots and just started dumping money in like crazy. And then all of a sudden grocery prices are going up. What? Why is this happening? It must be all of a sudden grocery store owners are greedy. The greed just ramped up in 2021, 2022, and then it suddenly, stopped. So no, it's not greed. It's that the Fed's monetary policy was a major driver of that. So, I dispute the premise, and as an Austrian school economist, we think the business cycle is caused by, monetary and interest rate policy.
If so, to throw sort of more conventional wisdom your way, If somebody came to you and were basically like, look, I'm really concerned about the Trump dismissal of Lisa Cook because we're moving into sort of uncharted waters. This is a uniquely partisan move. I mean, it's clear that Trump is attempting to basically execute a coup. Um, the future will look absolutely terrible. How would you convince that person that actually, like, what's the meme with the person, the astronaut shooting the other astronaut? Like, it's
Yeah, right.
always been this way. Like,
Right.
what's the best evidence that you can marshal that this is not, in fact, super unprecedented, but that it has always been a deeply partisan body?
There's some famous anecdote where apparently the Fed chair went down to visit LBJ in his ranch, and LBJ like pushed him up against a wall or something. So there's lots of lore like that. There's papers that assess what they call the political business cycles. I think the term they gave it, where just empirically do regression analysis, and it looks like when an election is coming up, that the central bank tends to loosen more, like meaning like to try to give the incumbent they make the economy better going into the election so the incumbent gets reelected, that sort of thing, like, favoritism of the government. But I want to be clear, maybe you're misunderstanding. I'm not happy with what Trump's doing. I think he
Yeah.
is a bully, and this is like banana republic behavior. So don't get me wrong, but I'm saying though, this idea that, oh my gosh, the much vaunted Fed independence is like, it's all like a big theater. And so I would rather just have a different system, given that the government's going to be in control of the stockpile of U.S. dollars. I would rather just be open and shut, that this is what it is. The Treasury is the one that creates this stuff, because then at least there'd be accountability. If inflation is too high, you'd say, oh, it's this administration's in charge, it's their policy, we're going to vote that. Whereas now you can't vote out Powell. You know what I mean? So I guess that's what I'm saying. So I don't like what Trump is doing, and this is bullying behavior. And I get now people, especially with them literally taking over companies, it's not just hyperbole from pink-haired leftists to say this is fascism. Like, yeah, that actually is the textbook definition of what fascism looks like.
Well, let
Not
me put,
Trump saying mean things on social media.
yeah, let me put the Trump administration's view to you as best I can summarize it or understand it. I'm basing this on the statements made by the Fed governors that were appointed by Trump, and they made they put out statements justifying why they voted against Powell's decision not to lower interest rates. And what they are saying is that essentially the interest rate, what they're saying is essentially that inflation isn't really that bad now and would be even lower if it were not for the one-time shock of tariffs. And unemployment, as Liz mentioned, is starting to look concerning. I'll pull up just so people can see where inflation is right now, according to the official statistics. Here we go. United States core inflation rate is about 3.1% as of July 2025, which is above what's the target is supposed to be, which is 2%. Here's a historical chart going back to 2016 of the core inflation rate. What do you make of the argument that, yeah, Powell is just being too conservative and it's time to slash the interest rates and get this economy heated up, baby?
Right. So with a lot of this stuff, there is a lot of hypocrisy involved in this. So occasionally I'm fine if someone just wants to observe and say, hey, there's a lot of hypocrisy here, and people who would have said one thing if Biden or Kamala now were in office are
Yeah.
saying a different thing. So I get that. And for example, like I've noticed there were a lot of left-leaning economists during the Biden years when price inflation was going through the roof, who kept coming out and saying, well, if you look at it, actually the bottom quintile of workers are doing the best of this. It's the rich fat cats that are hurt by inflation. No, rich people don't care if eggs go up. What are you talking about, right? And now they've remembered that, oh yeah, inflation hurts poor people now that Trump's back in office, right? So
Yeah, fair
I
point.
can observe all that, but at the same time, I guess my fundamental point here is, yeah, I get the Phillips curve analysis and the framework that people are using there to say, oh, there's this balance, but I totally reject that. In other words, to me, what causes the business cycle, the reason the unemployment rate occasionally shoots up to 8% is because of prior rounds of monetary expansion, right? So in other words, you're not doing the American people or the economy any favors by, artificially lowering interest rates and by pumping in money that ultimately, like a hard money standard, and a perfect world or better world, we would tie the dollar back to gold or something. To me, that would be better for everybody going forward, right? So I'm disputing the premise that, oh yeah, it would really help us, the American worker, if the Fed would just print some more money, and gosh darn it, Powell won't do it because he's too stingy or he's got a grudge against Trump. I dispute that premise. I don't actually think that would be good for anybody to do that.
Well, yeah, I before we brought you on, I was watching some of your recent videos that we'll link. There's a couple that we're going to link here. One is you spent a little over an hour explaining why the Federal Reserve should not exist, and then also making your case, the sort of pragmatic case for how we get there, because it sounds so far-fetched, but maybe there actually is a path to the world Bob Murphy wants to see. So I'm going to invite you just to distill that as much as you can. What is the 2 or 3 minute case for why the Fed should not exist, and how do we get there realistically?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the case for why it shouldn't exist. Fortunately, in the U.S., the Fed was only formed in 1913, right? So whereas other, like the Bank of England, has been around for centuries, so it's more realistic. And I invite people to go look up. It's by Selgin, White, and Lestrapes. And it's like, has the Fed been a failure? I think it's an academic paper, peer reviewed in the Journal of Macroeconomics. It's not some crankish Heritage Foundation data set or something. And they just go through and show by any empirical measure, certainly the purchasing power of the dollar, of like 1800 to 1900, the U.S. dollar's purchasing power was roughly constant over the whole stretch, in the aggregate, whereas now it's 99+ % has been lost since 1913. But also macroeconomic stability, right? That the business cycle was less intense before the founding of the Fed than after. Okay, so on any standard measure, the Fed has been a failure, whatever criteria of success you want to hold. And
Yeah,
then you
this
say, okay,
data right here is from that study that you're
okay.
referencing, as visualized by the aforementioned Heritage Foundation, but not pulled from their data, pulled from the study, the Selgin, Lastrup's White study. And yeah, the for our viewers, the higher number just means more volatility in the economy as a whole. And what Bob is saying here is that during that pre-Fed era, um, it was more volatile by this measure.
No, less volatile.
I mean, it's less
They're the
volatile. Sorry,
pre-Fed,
sorry.
yeah.
Yes, sorry. Reverse that.
So that's the prima facie case where the central bank's not doing us any favors, plus all the corruption and everything. But even just in terms of how did it do, by any measure, the economy was more volatile. Certainly, the dollar got crushed during the Fed's tenure than before. And then to say, okay, well, what do we do about it? So here, like, I'm not saying get rid of the Fed next Tuesday. What I'm saying is take away its powers to create money, right? So the New York Fed, they have a lot of intertwining relationships with the ECB and currency swaps and all this stuff. I agree, you can't just shut that down, but I'm saying take away the Fed's ability. If they want to go buy assets right now, they just electronically create the money. It doesn't come from somewhere. So I'm saying don't give them special prerogatives. Like right now, the Fed can do things that Citibank can, right? And so I'm saying make it so that the Fed doesn't have any special power that Citibank lacks. And then, and if it makes sense for them to continue all these things, let them go ahead and do that. And then we say, okay, but who gets the ability to create new money, what's called base money? I would say return that to the Treasury. And then the other thing I would add, given that we're going to go ahead and do that, well, what rules should they use to try to take the politics out of it? I would say go back to a hard gold standard where whatever market price, let's say it's $3,500 an ounce. So if you want more physical U.S. currency or the electronic version of that, you go and give an ounce of gold to the Treasury and they go put it in a vault and they print up $3,500 in new money and give it, Treasury notes and give it to you. Or they, credit your bank and it's like a deposit account with the Treasury as opposed to right now the big banks have accounts with the Fed. So that's the quick version. And again, I just remember in 1912, Americans used dollars. The Fed didn't exist. It's not that people thought, oh yeah, that's why we didn't have a good economy in the 1900s. No, the U.S. industrialized and became a world economic powerhouse without a central bank.
Are there things that Jerome Powell could feasibly do if he were listening to your advice, given the current structure that would,
Wait, hold on.
there's going to be
Before
acts
you
of legislation and so forth that are going to be needed to unwind what you're talking about. But given the current situation, are there ways the Fed chair and the Board of Governors could be acting to just kind of think of it like harm reduction. Like, what is the more
Mhm.
harm
Right.
reduction approach to how to run the Federal Reserve as it exists right now?
Okay. Were you going to say something, Liz?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want to return to Zach's question. Like, I don't want to totally derail, but I'm kind of interested in like in circa 1912, like, so were interest rates just not really set because everything was sort of gold standard tied?
Well, right. It's like saying right now, who in the U.S. government sets the price of crude oil? I mean, nobody does. It's a supply
Yeah.
and demand. So yes, there were back then interest rate. There were savers and borrowers, and based on the terms they hammered out, those were. I mean, there's not the interest rate, right? There's various interest rates depending on
Well,
the credit worthiness of the
yeah.
borrower. So that's what it was back then. There was no U.S. agency or delegated body that was in charge of setting, what we now think of as the federal funds rate.
How exactly were like reserves managed? Like currency?
Um, I mean, so the U.S. government had stockpiles of gold, and
Mhm.
anybody who wanted to could get gold. It was roughly $20.67 an ounce.
Hmm.
And so if you had, $2,067, you could turn it in and get 100 ounces of gold, less maybe like a fee or something, handling fee. And that's what kind of kept them honest. That was the classical gold standard before World War I. All the major powers defined their currencies, the French franc and the German mark and the British pound in terms of grains of gold, and that implied fixed exchange rates. And so if one country inflated too much, gold would flow out of its vaults and into the vaults of the other countries, and that kind of kept them from inflating too much.
But
And then once world yeah.
would returning to the gold standard and scrapping the central bank be a problem or an especially difficult thing to do though in such a globally interconnected economy where by and large other countries have central banks?
I don't think so. I mean, what would end up happening is if they did something like I said, there would be fewer dollars printed going forward. And when I say print, I also mean like metaphorically, than would have been the case under the status quo. And so the US dollar would strengthen against other currencies, and that might cause short-term adjustment problems for other countries, based on their exports or imports. But in principle, no, I don't think there's any. Again, it's to say, hey, doesn't humanity benefit if you have a bunch of central banks just printing up money? And no, that doesn't make us wealthier. If they could create more
Hmm.
oil or create more factories, yes, that would be good. But just creating more units of money doesn't make us richer.
Hmm. Sorry, I just needed to go back to 1912 for one moment in my little brain to sort of actually fully play out the scenario that you're proposing because at least like my at first blush my reaction to that is just, wasn't the US financial and monetary system so much less sophisticated back then than it is now? And so would this actually be able to be applied in the manner that you're suggesting? But frankly, I don't know, maybe.
Well,
Interesting.
I mean, one of the classic objections is that that lack of flexibility of not being able to inflate the money supply is dangerous when we head into recessions, when everything gets kind of locked up, that you need to inject money to that, like that's one version of what the Great Depression story, right? So what's wrong with that story in your mind?
Okay, well, I have a whole book, if you don't mind me plugging it, the politically incorrect guide to the Great Depression, the New Deal. And so you're right that what you said, Zach, is a story. And ironically, when Bernanke was praising Milton Friedman for explaining how he did it, I don't agree with Friedman's analysis on that. But it's still a funny story to say that. But because, Friedman's problem was, what happened from 1929 to 1933, measures like the M2 measure of the money stock collapsed by a third, right? So there is a sense in which the U.S. money supply went down by one third between 29 and 33. So it's not surprising the crop prices were falling and farmers are, their homes are getting taken over to, the banks are seizing their houses and stuff. Because how can you operate in an economy where the money supply shrinks by that? And what was happening is because there were bank failures and bank runs and people pulling their money out of the banks in terms of cash. And so then the banks had to call in their loans, right? And with the fractional reserve system, you put $100 in the bank. If they make multiple loans on top of that, that expands the money supply. But then in reverse, if people are pulling their money out of the banks. So Friedman's critique was, oh yeah, the Fed should have inflated enough to offset that. And they didn't, right? So, but what I point out in the book is to go through and say, well, that doesn't make sense because any measure you want to use, the Fed was the loosest it had been in history to that point in the going into the Great Depression, Whereas after World War I, there was a depression called the Depression of 1920 to 21. And most people don't even know about that because it was over real quickly, and then we had the Roaring '20s. And in that thing, the Fed jacked up interest rates, had a very tight policy, and prices and wages fell more aggressively in that period than they did in any 12-month stretch in the Great Depression, right? So it's not just, oh yeah, prices fell so much in the 30s, and that's why we had a decade of depression. No, prices fell more rapidly in 2021, but wages fell faster. So real wages. So that was the problem. Here's my quick answer to your question, Zach. Among other things, Herbert Hoover, when the stock market crash happened, called in all the labor union leaders and big business people and said, keep workers' wages constant, like how much you pay them per hour. Because he had this theory that, oh, what happens in a financial panic is that, revenues start falling, then the businesses cut wage rates, but now the public can't buy the product, and then it's just a downward spiral. So let's arrest that at the beginning, keep paying workers what you're paying them now, even though your sales are falling off, and then we'll just nip this in the bud. But no, that was the worst thing to do because now revenues are falling, but you got to keep paying workers the same amount per hour. So labor kept getting more and more expensive. So anyway, that to me, that if you had to point out like one of the big problems, that was a major one why unemployment went up so high.
Yeah, well, now that we've laid a lot of that out, and I appreciate you drawing that out, Liz, and getting us to explore a little bit more, what the history of the Fed actually looked like, or, pre and post Fed. I want to repose a more succinct version of that question I asked you earlier, Bob, which is, is there a way that Jerome Powell and the other governors of the Fed could make decisions that act more as if there is no Fed? Could they make a Fed that acts a little bit more Austrian?
Sure. So, on the one hand, I could be cheeky and people would say, well, what would you do if you were Fed? And I was I would resign, right? That's the libertarian answer.
Yeah.
And, you could do an analogy, say, oh, like if Gorbachev had come to me and said, how do we do state-run factories the right way? And I'd say, you can't, you got to private it, right? Okay, so all those analogies aside and caveats. Yeah, actually, what Powell's been doing, if people go and look at like the Fed's balance sheet, except for, brief things like during COVID, it's been shrinking over time, right? That Powell, I think, has been trying to return to a more normal monetary policy, right? And that's what Bernanke said after the 2008 crisis. You remember he was on 60 Minutes and, the guy's asking him, like, aren't people are worried about hyperinflation? And he's like, no. And he said, after this crisis, man, we're going to go back to normal and right. And no, by any metric, the Fed's balance sheet has not at all gone back to normal. But whereas Powell is trying to do that, I think, right? So, and it's interesting. He's not an academic. I think Powell, having some good business savvy and knowing how the financial markets work, realized if the world comes to believe that anytime we hit a bump in the road, the Fed's just going to open up the gushers and print $1 trillion, eventually, they're going to dump the dollar. And so we have to show them that, no, that was a temporary, COVID, okay, but now we're serious and we're going to tighten. And even if that does mean unemployment goes up a little bit, we have our inflation target and we're going to hit that. I think that's what he's trying to do. And it's just awkward for him that, Trump keeps lobbing bombs at him rhetorically. And so, to answer your question, they could do that in terms of just, tightening and letting the balance sheet shrink, which is what on the way up people were saying was going to happen. So he's just fulfilling what people said. But beyond that, like let's say people like my idea of targeting gold, they could just target the gold price. They could say, oh, if the US dollar price of gold is above 3,500, then we are going to slow the rate of money creation. Or they could, as the mortgage-backed securities and treasuries are maturing, they could roll that over and buy gold, right? I'm not saying they should do that, but I'm just saying that is a way they could more approximate, what to me would be a better regime.
Yeah, the events of the past couple of weeks have definitely increased my unease, both with the Federal Reserve and what we talked about at the beginning of the political conversation, of the conversation with Intel, and it's made worse by the fact that there's no solution on the other side of the aisle. If it really is kind of as bleak as it seems to be, what are you doing, like personally, politically, financially? Like, do you have any thoughts as to like How do you position yourself in this moment where you just see some storm clouds gathering up ahead?
Bottled water and chickens. So, and actually, if people did want to do that, I wouldn't say that'd be a bad idea. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, and this is stuff that I've been doing when I was going on giving talks to audiences going back at like 2010. But yeah, I think in general, you got to just be hedged and play defense. That it's it's hard to know. Like I said, it's if people thought the Fed were going to keep doing what it did, during the rounds of QE, and then after the COVID, then people would want to unload and get rid of dollars. But it's this weird thing when a crisis hits, people rush to the dollar, and so it's this kind of
Yeah.
odd mixture. So, but I do think long term, people are more and more people are realizing, yeah, the Fed is not trustworthy, and given the stuff that Trump's doing, also like the Biden administration, the measures they were deploying against Russia, whatever you think, in terms of foreign policy, but just like people who had nothing to do with what Putin was doing, and all of a sudden their assets get frozen and things like that, and they get locked out of the SWIFT system. So I think a lot of countries around the world are realizing we need to back away from just being so intertwined with the U.S. because they're unpredictable at this point. And so I think, yeah, over the coming decades, the U.S. dollar is going to shrink in importance. So I would just say to people that, yeah, you want to diversify your portfolios and not be so U.S. centric. And I'm big on gold and Bitcoin, if that's the kind of thing you're asking me. But my overall arching advice though to people is diversify your income streams, right? In other words, not just given what my net worth is right now, how should I allocate my portfolio, but you got to figure out other ways to bring in income because the world over the next 5 years is going to be crazy.
Yeah.
That's right, boys and girls. Bob Murphy is suggesting that you become cam girls. Terrible.
And boys, come
Yeah.
on.
Let's be inclusive
Multi-level
here.
marketing gals too. All these things. That's the way to diversify. Bob Murphy, we want to pose the final question of the show to you that we ask all of our guests. What is one question that you think more people should be asking?
If you don't trust the government with things like Epstein, why would you trust them for other areas?
Fair enough. Thanks
Excellent.
so much, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think, and if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.